Welcome to this webinar today. We're pleased to have you joining us. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series. Our host today is the Rochester Business Alliance. Rochester has the distinction today of being 1 degree colder than Atlanta is, so it's cold all over the place. But a nice, warm, happy new year to all of you that are on this broadcast today. We'd like to remind you that Firestorm, does advance, please, Jim?
I'm going to try, Bill. There it goes.
There we go. We'd like to invite you to become our friend at Facebook, Firestorm Solutions. You can also follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. And yes, there is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that the presentation today is not complete without accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product provided must be read in conjunction with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, please keep in mind that the information and comments in this webinar should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. We're so pleased to have the Rochester Business Alliance as our co-host, sponsor, and underwriter of this Crisis Coach webinar series. And our host today is Chip Dawson. Chip, would you like to make some comments about the Rochester Business Alliance?
I'd be delighted to, Bill. Thank you. And good morning and Happy New Year, everyone. Welcome to the first in the 2015 series of the Crisis Coach and our 15th overall. The Rochester Business Alliance is delighted to partner with Firestorm and our friends at the Eastern Great Lakes Association of Contingency Planners to bring you, our members, this critical 45-minute discussion by Jim Satterfield, one of the country's top crisis managers, covering the first of 3 sessions on building an intelligence network. Today's session is How Do You Know What You Don't Know? Behaviors of Concern in Intelligence Networks. In wishing you a Happy New Year a moment ago, it was a sincere wish that 2015 will in fact be new, different, and perhaps better than the year past. But it's not starting out that way. 2 more NYPD officers were shot and wounded Monday evening in the Bronx, and a Rochester teacher visiting her son, daughter-in-law, and grandson in Palm Springs was killed Sunday in a double murder-suicide. Instances of violence and bullying within Rochester businesses since the first of the year have so far not been egregious enough to make the media. Jim and others who study the issue of violence will tell you that there is nearly always a tell, a tip, a clue, someone new. The task you and your management face is to bring that clue forward so it can be acted upon. We ride a fine line between the casual brush-off, oh, he gets moody, and the overreaction. And that's where Firestorm and this webinar and Jim come in. Now here's Jim.
Thanks, Chip, and I appreciate the analysis as always. I think you do an excellent job of putting things in perspective for us as we talk about what's going on and what's around us. I also think that the world that we're in today, the rate of change continues to accelerate. The tragic events yesterday in Paris, an example of what we can see at any time, and I think it underscores the fear of an isolated attack by 1 or 2 or 3 individuals can bring onto our world. We continue to see communicable illness as an issue. In fact, Chip and I were talking about an experience that his family had at Christmas. This flu season is certainly elevated, and if I were to tell you that we had 30 people die from Ebola in the United States, that would raise an alarm, and people would suddenly be concerned. We've already had 28 children die in America this year from the common flu. And so the flu season is not something to be taken lightly because we're familiar with it. We don't really invest the time that we need to look at, and the vast majority of states now have reached significant levels of flu exposure, and we've not reached the end of that season. We also now have seen a return with measles outbreaks in 10 states across the country, and highlighted in the Disneyland outbreak that occurred just this past week. So these types of areas certainly are factors that we need to look at and be concerned about. And in thinking about what could happen to your organization next, that's an important aspect, and I think Chip's introduction framed that very well. What are the triggers? What are the things that we should look for to find out what could occur within the organization? And I hopefully today will give you some insights around that with behaviors of concern so that you can start to see that aspect come together. But today we're also going to spend some time talking about the components that come together to create an intelligence network within your organization. Our process is predict, plan, perform. We need to understand the vulnerabilities and threats. What are their impacts? What is it that we monitor? And we're going to be talking about that specifically today. And then the second thing that Chip talked about, the triggers. What are the cues that we want to see before we carry that forward? Then the plans can go into place, and the training and performing and the responding can happen. But the intervention needs to come very early in the process, and that's what we're going to be discussing today as we go through. So who's responsible for managing risk? And it is the responsibility of management. If you're a company and an organization, that goes to the board and the senior leadership, whether you're public or private. If you're a school, the school board and the head of school it has that responsibility. But most people don't focus on identifying these risks before they occur. All of the discussions on workplace violence are talking about the proper response technique, the flee, the hide, the fight, in those aspects. Or if you're in a school environment, lockdown, lockout, evacuation, those types of aspects. If we can elevate this to the point that we can focus on the before they occur, that changes the parameters for all of our organizations. And if we can't eliminate these risks, they're going to have a disproportional impact on our people, brand, and reputation. No one wants to pick up the phone to call a family member and say, your loved one isn't coming home today. Think about what it was like for the people in Paris to hear on the news that there was an attack where their spouse worked. And what does that mean, and how does it come together? And they gained entry into the space by confronting a lady who had her child next to her to get the code to be able to enter into the offices of the publication. Imagine the impact on that family knowing what ultimately happened and as a result of those areas. So can you really predict a crisis? The answer is unequivocally yes. There are warning signs that go unheeded. And so what you have to do is, what are the indicators that we ought to look for? And that's going to lead us into a discussion today about behaviors of concern, but we're going to expand it a little bit as we go forward to try to put that in place. And these indicators can give us some indication of both frequency, how often is it going to happen, and severity, and how bad it would be. So if you understand the indicators, then you can find the crisis before it happens and address it at a much lower level within your organization. So these are cues. They're clue cues. That's a tongue twister this morning with my coffee, that you can get information about emerging events. They could be behavioral cues. They could be transaction or process changes that are transmitted by verbal, things that people say, or nonverbal means. And in many cases, we see that moving into the world of social media. So our focus today is to establish a background of thinking that we can make a difference before these events happen if we're focused on the warning signs and the indicators that these events are starting to occur. So everyone in your organization must know the warning signs. It doesn't do any good if you're the guy who knows and no one else knows within it. And it's behaviors of concerns, threats, or statements of intent to cause harm. And Chip, I liked your comment that, oh, that's just the guy, and that's the way he is, and the discounting of those statements. What we see time and again is that there is a point when it's not just the guy, it's just not the statement. It really indicates that there is a pathway to violence, that they could be exhibiting those areas. So we're really thinking about today behaviors of concern in a different way than we've talked in the past. And we're trying to establish a different perception of what we need to look at. And when you think about this, our goal is to create an intelligence network. That's the only way that we can figure out how we know what you don't know. It's sitting out there, it's there, but if you're not looking for it, you're not going to find it, and it's going to make a difference. So our goal is always to know today what's going to happen tomorrow. If we knew that, and by the way, it was interesting that the attack in Paris occurred at the time they had an editorial meeting in the conference room, and all of those individuals were in one place at one time. And so thinking about that, knowing where the exposures are and changing your strategies at varying times can well make a difference. So across this, our goal is to really take the uncertainty that's in this world and convert it to certainty, and we'll talk ultimately about metrics in that. It's the knowing the what, the where, the when, and the patterns that are coming out of these areas that we're going to talk about. Later in the year, we'll do a much more in-depth discussion around social media and the indication tools there. We'll hit you with a couple of the details today, but that's an area that we have found universally is not in place and is going to be one of the key elements in designing how you respond and plan for these behaviors of concerns. So the process is that to know, you must listen and look. And we're going to continue that theme of listening and looking as we talk today. Listening is creating a conversation aggregators, understanding what's being said in general about your business, about your school, about your organization, and about people. And we do that by looking at streams and phrases and words. And it creates a general situational awareness of what's going on within an organization. Think about what occurred at Sony with the data breach there. And they had employees who were suddenly concerned that their identity and their confidential information was put out over the Internet. Listening then into that situation, you could pick that up in the communications that were going on, and that would have told management that they needed to deal with those stakeholders and change how they communicated and looking. Looking is then more focused on a specific location, an event, or a person based upon an identified crisis, risk, threat, exposure, or vulnerability. This person of interest then, we now are going to look at them in more deep dive. We maybe identified them with the overall listening, but now we need to go back and look in it. We can use things like geocoding, looking at the location of where the comments and postings came from. We worked with a company who had a distribution center. We put up a geofence around it, identified a person of interest who made 50 postings during one 8-hour shift, and it indicated that there was racial tension and particularly a dispute between that individual and his supervisor, and he was making the statements that the only way that this could be resolved was by bringing a gun, and threats were made. So looking in more detail, then you can figure it out. The spheres of influence show us who is this person talking to, who else is involved in this, how do we carry it forward, and so it becomes a targeted awareness. We also have the capability here to go back in time and see what was said not only today, but yesterday and last week as we start to build these areas. So the virtual investigation capabilities become quite important today and completely different than were available just even a few years ago. This is an area that, as you think about behaviors of concern, creating an intelligence network makes a major change within your organization. If you're providing a service to others, what are they saying about the service? What are they thinking about? Is there disharmony that will come together? So when we get into the area of predictive intelligence, and I think that's an important aspect to think about here, we're not focused just on information. We're trying to move this into an area where it becomes actionable. And communications is the most perishable form. The value of that declines over time. Knowing what the enemy is doing today versus what they were doing 3 months ago, it's the timing of this that becomes very, very important. It encompasses hard and soft data. Soft data are those behavioral clues, as Chip was sharing with us, and some intuition and your past experience. Hard data could include emails, social media postings, admonitions of intent, become much more hard data that we can shape as we look at these behaviors of concern. Now, technology can certainly aid in this area in giving us the monitoring analytics and the metrics that we're looking for, and that's the looking and listening that I talked about earlier. The other key element here is the last point on this page, and we're going to mention this again in a few minutes as we get into a behavioral risk approach and a program that you need to have within your organization. And that there needs to be a central repository. It's great to have the information, but who has it? Who has access to it? How do you see the patterns that develop over time? And so having a central repository that you manage that information and someone responsible for it makes a major difference. So let's now look at a broader picture. If we're talking about creating an intelligence network, what are some potential components that we would have in it? Certainly the background checks and identifying someone that's a party of interest before these events. The shooting that occurred at the VA yesterday, that was a former employee who came back, and we see that pattern repeated over and over in workplace violence areas. Anonymous reporting, having that capability within your organization so that someone can feel free to come forward. And we'll do a whole presentation just on anonymous reporting, and in many cases why it doesn't work. The see something, say something, which sounds very good, in practice doesn't turn out quite as well as we hope. The behavioral risk threat assessment, and we're going to talk a lot about that today, that's going to be the key anchor as a part of your intelligence network, and it's how you use the information that the other three items here are listed in putting it together in an actual format. The social media monitoring is the last element associated with it. And again, all of this is looking to identify a risk, something before it becomes a crisis, a risk event for which one has not identified the vulnerabilities and exposures, has not developed a plan, and therefore does not know how to respond. So the intelligence network is geared toward making a difference and intervening before that crisis occurs. Now, as we think about this, and we think about the behavioral threat assessment, if we've identified a person that we're concerned about, what do we do? And let's start breaking this apart. And you see the little chart over on the right. We want to intervene down at that behaviors of concern before the thermometer or barometer there, it escalates to threats, to physical injury or death. That's our intent, is to always intervene at the lowest possible level. So I want to try to create a continuum at this point to begin our discussion, and we're going to delve increasingly deeper into these behaviors of concern. If there's something that's very minor and you feel it's low and not a major concern, you handle it with your normal discipline, your normal HR policies and procedures. It's minor. It's not going to be a particular concern. If it's certainly high, someone's there in the workplace, there's a gun, there's an attack, then we're calling 911. It's a violent situation, and those elements are easy. So the extremes we can handle very clearly. Very minor, normal. Major, we're calling 911 and getting the police to intervene. It's that medium area where the concern comes in, the behaviors of concern. Is it really that bad? Is it really going to be something that we have to think about? And as we focus today on behavioral risk threat assessment, that's the focus. The focus is that middle section to determine, is it closer to the normal discipline? Is it more elevated to that higher level where violence is imminent? What's our action plan? How are we going to intervene? And how are we going to make a difference? Now, as you can imagine, that requires skill and judgment and training in order to render those opinions. And we're going to divide those even further into three categories, the behaviors of concern, as we continue to talk. So what we want to do is to have a program that would assist in identifying, assessing, managing, and monitoring those exhibiting these behaviors of concern. If we've identified it, we need to monitor to find out, is it escalating or is it de-escalating? We've got numbers of opportunities where we've worked with companies who've had employees and there's been a concern. And intervention correctly can help de-escalate that and help the employee, help those in the workplace, and those around that particular individual long before it escalates to a point of risk. So there has to be a framework. There has to be a structure. You just don't show up and immediately start doing this. So as we delve deeper a little into the program, there are 4 elements that we want to state that you need, and then we're going to go into the plan in much more detail as we carry forward. That's creating awareness. Everybody in the organization needs to know what those visual cues are to be able to identify them. The reporting, that people have to know who to report it to and provide it with multiple means. We talked about the anonymous reporting, for example. There has to be a central repository. We've got to retain this information over time, because viewing it over time tells us a great deal. It's the difference between a motion picture and a still picture. A still picture is a point of time. That's the image at that point. You can't tell, is it increasing or is it decreasing? If we look at it over an extended period, we can suddenly see the patterns, and then the 2 events that individually might not have been enough to warrant a behavior of concern, when added together, clearly indicate that. And then finally, there has to be a plan. Now, BERTHA is the acronym for a behavioral risk threat assessment, and we took the BE out of behavior, the R out of risk, the TH out of threat, and the A out of assessment. It just gives us a little easier way to discuss it. And you'll see the elements that are included in that. If there has been an incident, a threat, or a behavior of concern, that middle category that we talked about just a few minutes ago, there has to be an investigation, screening, an action plan for that individual, continued monitoring, sign off by everyone involved, and accurate record keeping of what goes through it. So as we go through and think about that, there has to be a methodology within the organization. Could you take one and set it up? Absolutely. But think about how the information gets flowed. How do we know that we're treating everyone the same way within the organization? And who is going to conduct this investigation? Who's going to render the legal opinion that this person is a risk to themselves or another? Should you involve your legal counsel with it? So we would recommend that you designate a team within your organization. Even a small company, you would find a group, and 3 people generally at a minimum would make up the team. We recommend keeping the team small. The larger the team, the more complex it becomes, and it's easier from this organization. Clearly someone from an HR perspective, if you have someone dedicated to security, and then someone from management would pull those areas together. You need to determine what screening tools that you're going to use, and there are a bunch of them out there, protocols from the Secret Service and the FBI. We're neutral on which protocol you accept or which service that you use, but there are values and weaknesses in each, but having the uniformity of continually doing the same thing makes a difference. Then you have to clearly establish when you're going to convene, under what circumstances, and then upon the end of the investigation and screening, you've got to implement a corrective action plan. You'll be doing interviews with the employee and coworkers. In a case of a school, you'd probably be doing interviews with the parents. We've been involved where family members, even in a business scenario, needed to be approached as a result of some of the threats and issues that came together. So here are those same elements that we showed on an earlier slide, broken out with a little more definition around each one of them. It's the how do we document the behavior of concern, what's the investigation process that we're going to go through. Clearly there are forms, there are processes that would move forward, and again, training plays a key element. This medium area, and we're going to come to this again in more detail on the next slide, but it's where we're taking that medium, not the low, where it would normally just be handled by your HR policies, your normal disciplinary procedures, or the 911, it's so violent, we get the police involved. There has to be the screening there, and that's where this behavioral assessment team comes in, greatly involved. It may require that you have an outside resource that you can refer some of the more extreme cases as we divide those apart. And we divide this medium area into 3 elements: guarded, elevated, and severe. Those are the areas that you're going to be rendering a judgment on in that medium category, because we take different actions depending upon the level to which that behavior comes. Then the action plan. What are we going to do with this person now? Based upon the screening that we've gone through, based upon the recommendations that we come out, how do we monitor them, and keeping the records and the commitment so that you go through a normal process within those areas. Now, when I talked about those 3 element areas, you see here some description. So the guarded, that's the lowest level. We've got to do some supervision and some intervention with the person because there was a screening and a date certain that we're going to do follow-up with that particular individual. If it's a little bit more than that, and remember the guarded is at the low end of that medium sector, then we're going to do more supervision and intervention. There's going to be a specific follow-up and some continual screening and looking at what's going forward. If it's at the severe level, and as you've gone through and done the interviews and you've asked the questions and you've used the screening, whether it's the Secret Service or the FBI or one of the others, you would want to remove that person from the workplace. You know, you'll notice on the guarded and elevated, we're keeping those people at work. When we hit severe, we're going to remove them from the workplace until they're deemed no longer to pose a threat of harm to themselves or others. By the way, suicide is a major start of workplace violence. In many cases, we find that there are death lists or kill lists that are held by the person who wants to even the score before they kill themselves. There must be, in this area, a written action and monitoring plan and very specific terms of reentry before return. This is one where you would want to have a referral to a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a forensic psychologist who can render an opinion that it is safe for this individual to return to the workplace as we come together. So as you think about your program and what you currently do about identifying behaviors of concern, this type of an approach gives you a much more pragmatic way that we can take the emotion out of it and deal with it more efficiently in the workplace as we go forward. Guarded, elevated, and severe. So what are we looking at? What are the triggers that will cause some of the recognition? Threats. Is any threat? And we've had discussions in previous webinars about veiled threats, or if you don't do this, I'll do that. That's conditional. But the threats could escalate all the way to a specific threat at a specific time targeted to a specific individual with specific capabilities to deliver. So there's a continuum of threats that we look at, but obviously any threat should be considered a behavior of concern. Verbal behavior, the interactions, is the person argumentative, is someone who has not had a particular problem, maybe now has developed a substance problem in an area, that you observe that through the conversation that they carry forward. Written behavior, that's that entire intelligence network that we've talked about. What are they saying on Facebook? What are they saying on Twitter? What are they posting in terms of pictures and information? That written behavior, which is generally missed by organizations and clearly becomes one of the key tools once we've identified an individual, a person of interest. So if you had a report that an employee was a problem, that's where you would want to then specifically start looking at that employee's profile on social media, the comments that they're saying about the workforce. We're working with a company, and we identified a comment from one of their security people, and it was a posting that he made on the internet and sharing some comments and observations about what was going on. And he had it under a name, but it was on a Facebook page where his picture was posted. We reported it to the company. They looked at it and said, well, that name's not one of our people, but when they showed the picture, it was one of their people. And so there are plenty of opportunities to identify this prior to the escalation. Clearly, something becomes physical. If it's if there's a hit or a blow or some striking that comes in, the sexual molestation and abuse aspects, domestic violence, we're seeing domestic violence coming into the workplace. And particularly if one employee knows that another employee is having a problem at home, knowing about that, it makes a big difference for an intervention and identifying it before it comes together. And then finally, any of the threats of suicide. So these at a very high level are the triggers and the cues that we're talking about to begin the awareness level that we would then go back through with that investigation, do the monitoring, develop the plan, do the interviews, and then we can determine what the action should be. Is it just our normal discipline? Is it a major threat that we need to pick up the phone and call 911? Or is it in that middle category where it becomes much grayer? And that's the breaking of this into the guarded, elevated, and severe. Different things come together because clearly at that point we do different actions. So the individual action plans that we do with those employees in the guarded, elevated, and severe levels have to be continually reviewed until we see that there's no longer a risk or a threat associated with it. The action plan must be disseminated within your organization, and those that have an interest in this particular person, the supervisor, the HR, the security, those within the organization to come together. So having a written action plan of what you're going to do with this individual is a key element associated with it. So as we talk about all the elements that are there, and we gave the components on an earlier slide, and we talked about doing all of these things, it just doesn't happen. This has to be a formal program that becomes a part of the culture within your organization as you step through each of these elements. And the level of documentation can be quite complex. And here's the first steps, just for example, of a report of an investigation. You get the report in. Life and safety first. If it looks like there's a threat, then we obviously need to escalate. Depending upon the urgency, complete the incident forms, gather additional documentation. It goes on and on and on to spell this out. But you can see that having this documented, being able to check the box that, yes, we have in fact done this, makes a difference for us to be able to manage and pull it together. We live in interesting times. We see a continuing escalation of threats within our organizations, but we need to then escalate our level of response and our plan design and how we come together. So as we think about next steps, do you want to know what will happen tomorrow? That's a question to ask. And if the answer to that's no, then the answer is no, and you're not going to spend the time and the effort involved to put that in place. But my question back to you, if you've answered that question no, then can you afford not to know? I would much rather deal with a behavior of concern than to deal with an act of violence that occurs within our workplace. The impacts on that will last much longer than the actual incident as it's come together. So if you'd like to know more about this, you can contact us and we can help you align your plans to standards and best practices. I think you need to create an intelligence network. We've seen that make a difference within organizations. Because not everybody reports when they see something, they say something. That's the listening. Are you listening to what's going on out there? And then are you looking to understand completely. Or just scheduling some training to go together to learn, this is how we recognize those areas. This is the questions that we would ask to do the screening. Here's how we develop an action plan and coming into place. So those are all elements that you might consider as next steps as a result of being with us today. If you want an assessment of your plans, whether it's school preparedness or preparedness in your business, business continuity, workplace violence, or behavioral threat risk assessment, Firestorm would be delighted to perform one for your organization and waive the fee cost associated with that. Just reach out to us and we'll be back to you and help in those areas. We'd like to thank the Rochester Business Alliance and the Association of Contingency Planners, the Eastern Great Lakes chapter, to underwriting this webinar series and sharing this information. Chip, I'd like to come back to you because you did a very good job, I think, in the intro as we talked about the cues and understanding these things. Any other observations you want to share with our listeners today?
Well, Jim, I think just a general one. I was surprised at myself at how frequently my mind went to various situations and issues that I've dealt with over the years, and wondering about how your plan, your process would have made that easier to address or deal with. Very valuable discussion. And that suggests that I remind our listeners today that all of your past year's programs, webinars, are posted on your website. And if they just go to www.firestorm.com/RBA, they will be able to see every one of those, listen to what you have to say, or Harry, whoever did the program. And this program in particular, I'm thinking that some of the folks may want to bring their management into it, and I suspect this will be posted on your website sometime in the next few days, so that they could sit down with their management in front of a computer and go through the program and have a more in-depth discussion about that. So thanks very much, Jim. As always, really valuable.
Well, we appreciate your time, Chip, to think about the areas and to coordinate and help to disseminate the information. Managing behaviors of concern is easy to say, but there needs to be details. There needs to be plans. And I think if you take the continuum of the minor infraction that your normal discipline handles to the 911 call at the extremes, pull those off the table. It's that gray area right in the middle. It's more than just minor and not quite all the way to violence, where there's an uncertainty, and that failure to act there time and time and time again, we see that as the key point within the organization. I would encourage everyone to think about dividing that into the three areas: guarded, elevated, and severe. That will help you then to better manage those individuals once you understand it, but you need to have a program in place to do that. So we're going to continue to share some insights this quarter, talking about creating this intelligence network and what's involved associated with that as we go under the covers. And Chip correctly pointed out, you can go to the Firestorm website and firestorm.com/RBA, and you can listen to this webinar again, or view other webinars, or share that with others in your organization to do that. If you have particular questions, you can contact us at webinars@firestorm.com, and we would certainly try to get back and answer your questions. We're going to try to reach out to those today on the call and see if there are questions that we can in particular answer. The other thing you can do is pick up the phone and call us at 800-321-2219. So, Chip, thanks again, and thanks to the Rochester Business Alliance, and thanks to the people at the Association of Contingency Planners. As we see working in the Western New York area, what can be done? How can we help businesses to do a better job of addressing the behaviors of concern within their organization? Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and Happy New Year. I hope that 2015 is the most prosperous that you've had. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, Jim.
Appreciate it. Bye.